really. And I'm absolutely delighted to have her in the studio today because, boy, I have wanted to interview you for so many years, and we could never seem to make it happen, but here you are.
Oh, thank you, Karl. It's my honor to be here.
Thank you.
When you wrote me and asked me if I'd be interested in coming on the show, it was like a nanosecond for me to type, yeah.
Well, I'm glad.
Well, it's lovely. It's lovely to see you.
I want to start at the beginning. You have roots in Placentia Bay. I think your father probably came from there?
My father came from Red Island, but my mom's crowd were also from Placentia Bay. That was Jersey side. Her mom was a Kemp from Jersey side, and they ran the post office. And my dad was basically 6 siblings. They all were teachers, and they grew up on Red Island. And in the time when the Argentia base was really active, my dad came and got a job working in Argentia. And my mom, because her family were in Jersey side, her mom's and her sisters, you know, her aunts, that is, they would always spend their summers out in Placentia. So one of these nights, it was the 8th of the 8th, 1947, there was a dance at the base, and Mom was there with her best friend, and they saw this guy walk across the floor looking like Van Johnson. My dad really looked like Van Johnson.
Did he really?
Crazy. I wish I could just show you a picture. It was amazing. He was like a doppelganger or whatever that word is. Anyway, so she looked to her friend Chris Madigan and said, that's the man I'm going to marry. And 1 year later, August 21st, they got married. So there's the Placentia Bay connection, and then they moved into St. John's as they started to have children, and then my dad started teaching, and my mom worked at the Gosling Library, and then she had, when she started to have a family, she stopped working for a while. So there's a big connection to Placentia Bay. And then my mom ended up working at the Arts and Culture Library for 25 years because flash forward a few, about 10 years later, my dad died quite young. He was only 50 and he had a heart attack. And so my mom went to work at the library in Arts and Culture. So
Was it your father who liked to sing?
he not only liked to sing, he made 33 albums.
You're kidding.
But we can't find them. We could not find them, and we all have just concluded that they were lost in the resettlement. Because after resettlement, our house, the Barry House on Red Island, remained. And what happened on many of the islands, there was a lot of vandalism. Like people would just, for a lark, they'd take the boat over and they'd just sort of go in and loot around. And that's the only thing we can figure out, because he made these 78s, because while he was working on the base in Argentia, he hooked up with a couple of Americans who had set up a studio, and they had brought like a 78 recording machine, whatever.
Well, the Americans had everything.
Yes, exactly. And my dad actually met Frank Sinatra. They rode in a dory over to, now some people say, oh yeah, everyone says that, but I think it's true, because my dad used to go to Mass over in Placentia from Jersey side, and they'd row in the dory. And so Blue Eyes himself was in the boat one morning, and Louis Armstrong was there too, and I know my dad talked about him. So it was a wonderful environment for a singer, and so he recorded all this music.
So did he make these records just for his own personal use?
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Yes.
And what kind of music did he
Oh,
sing?
he was like, he sounded like Bing Crosby. He was total tenor, Irish classic, like Take Me Home Kathleen, Galway Bay. His signature song was Danny Boy. So I grew up with this tenor voice, and I have a brother, Patty, who's a beautiful singer. Patty's a tenor too. And of course, I'm a contralto. So when we sing together, it's wonderful for our harmonies, because he's got the high end and I got the low end, and we call ourselves Hansel and Gretel, right? And so my dad had this absolutely glorious voice, and when I was a little girl, my fondest memories of being a kid were hanging out with my dad in the back. We grew up in Kellysbrook, which at the time had a river, and it was really lush. There was lots of trees, and to this day, every time I walk up the trail, can't help but hear the river. You can hear it in spots. And so we'd walk along, and he used to make little instruments, and he'd play flutes, and he'd be singing all the time. So that was my memory of my father. He was very quiet, whereas my mom was a total chatterbox. I mean, she was a Fitzgibbon. Her dad was Joe Fitzgibbon, the counselor, politician. He was in city politics for 50 years, and he also was with the Squires government, even though he said Squires was a crook. Should I say that? But anyway, my grandfather was a real social presence in the West End of St. John's, and they lived on Hamilton Avenue and Patrick Street. So my mom grew up in politics, basically, and they were all like major social people, very loquacious people. So she meets Dad, who's this very sensitive artist. He was a singer and he was a teacher, and he was very gentle. So I used to spend most of my time with my dad. So needless to say, when he died, it was very, very traumatic for me to lose him, because he died so suddenly too. That's always hard. But I have his voice, the memory of him singing on the shores of Placentia Bay, because we did go to Red Island a couple of times, and that was probably my earliest memory, was taking the big old CN ferry from Argentia to Red Island. And I remember being so small that they laid me in the suitcase because I was seasick. And they said, Mom said, oh, Pat, just put her in the suitcase. But they just laid me on the deck, and then I calmed down. And I remember going across the plank and seeing this beautiful island. And contrary to what, like sometimes people think like Red Island's probably like Belle Island, but it's really lush, And I always think that must be because of the Gulf Stream brushing underneath it, because there's lots of valleys, and it was green. And my dad had said, sun's always shining on Red Island, and I've been there probably 5 times. Sun is always shining.
I wonder how it got the name Red Island.
Everyone got red hair.
Well,
my dad had red hair, and there's a ton of redheads from Red Island.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
but also, I think that's my version.
Yeah.
I think the soil is red too.
Okay. Were there any other musical influences in your early life? What about the church or?
Well, I wondered if you knew that I started music when I was 24 years old.
Oh, I did not.
Now, I think that's a very important part of my story, because I was actually told by the nuns, God love them, that I couldn't sing because I had a deep voice, and girls with deep voices can't sing. So I grew up, honestly, pantomiming. And it was the biggest heartbreak of my whole childhood and high school, because I went to Holy Heart of Mary, Bless Me Father, for Iverson Regional High School, which had the best music program. And I was on the outside. I could never sing. And so it was the strangest thing, though, because I really didn't believe they were right. I really thought that I knew I could sing. I knew in my heart and in my soul, because it was such a deep love for music. And I always had that from a little girl. Like, I knew I was going to be a singer when I was about 7. I even said it at 5, I was going to be a singer. And at 7, I knew it. But then this whole thing happened at school. So I ended up, and all my friends had pianos. So when I'd go to their houses, I'd sort of tinker a little bit on the piano. And I'd always sing outside. Like, I'd go walking in that same Kellysbrook. And I would just, because, I could just sing my heart out. So I'd sing all the time. So I sang all the time. But it was only when I was, like, in my early 20s, I decided, that's it. I know this is what I want to do. I rented a piano. I started taking music theory classes, 3 hours a night for 5 nights a week for 6 months. And then this man, this was in Vancouver, and he said to me, I think you should maybe think about going to music school because you're so devoted to it. And I said, me, music school? Wow. Do you think I could go? Like, not having started at, 4, because so many musicians start so young, right? He said, well, I would bet you could do it, So that was one of the most, it was a big endorsement for me to go to audition. So this story is kind of a turning point, because I auditioned, I sang 2 songs, the singing went well, and then the 3 jury members were basically trying to see what my other skills were at music, and they said, okay, sight read this, and I couldn't do it. I had just been taking these theory classes. I still couldn't sight read on the spot. And then they looked at me and they said, you don't have musical training, do you? And I said, Well, no, because when I was, and then I told him the story about the nuns, and then, but my dad was a singer, and I grew up with music all through my life. And anyway, they went away for an hour and a half, came back and said, you know, we hardly ever accept anyone into our program who has no musical background. But once in a blue moon, someone comes along that we accept purely on potential. So I got into music school, and it was a jazz school. So I didn't know the difference between jazz and do-re-mi. I mean, I was a beginner, and you know, I graduated. 3 years later, I did 144 credits altogether, tons of classes. I did conducting, I did classical theory and history, I did jazz improvisation, and I especially studied singing with this wonderful teacher named Judith Moss, who was a New Yorker who had basically moved to Vancouver. So basically my music started at 24 years old. And when I graduated, I went to Quebec City for 3 days, stayed 10 years, because I was playing every night. And that's where I got my chops. That's where I started performing. And I never stopped.
Wow.
And that was 37 years ago. So.
Talk for a little bit about composition, because I'm curious about the process you use when you're actually sitting down to write a song. How does that work for you?
Well, a lot of the times I actually walk when I'm writing a song. I find walking an excellent, I guess I'm going to call it meditation, but there's something about walking that is, gets your lyrics flowing and rhythm. There's a real rhythm to walking. I think a lot of my songs are born through the word first. And so a lot of my ideas would come from walking. I've always walked, like, I still walk all the time, like every day. And then the sitting at the piano part is where the music is born. And it's not like they're separate. I mean, it's just that they come together separately, and then they come together. So sometimes I do have songs that were only music for maybe a few months, and I just hear this motif, I just hear this idea or a rhythm over and over and over again, but then I'll find one of those walks, I'll just get into like a line. Like, I saw something I wrote the other day, and I went, oh yeah, how come I didn't write anything? I have like sort of dangling lyrics in my books, but I know where they are, and every now and then I'll sit and I'll start with a line. Like, when I was a little girl, I never went to bed. I drove my mother nuts. No ifs or ands or buts. Like, this is I'm working on this song about my mom and about my dad, because he was the one that was given the job of taking me out in the back to try to make me get tired to go to sleep at night. So he used to say, we're going to go look for the leprechauns. And so we'd go out back and we'd walk around the block about 4 times. And my dad would be like, well, I guess the leprechauns aren't out tonight. Let's just go on home. And I'd be, but where's the leprechauns, Dad? And then, so I remember, I forgot about that. And then one day I was just thinking about Mom and how I must have driven her nuts, because I was always reluctant to go to bed. I still don't want to. I love being awake. And in the morning, I wake up at like 5 o'clock, you know, and I think, oh, can you stay till like 5:30, please? And I'll just, but there's something exciting about, so I'm sorry, I rambled a bit, but that's sort of I don't necessarily sit down and plan on writing, but I do write all the time. And I can claim that one of my biggest mentors in my life was not a songwriter, except for, I do have songwriting mentors, like Ron Hines was a very dear friend, and he and I hung out a lot. First person I ever sang with was with Ron Hines. But one of my biggest mentors was actually Jerry Squires, because Jerry was someone that I visited out in the lighthouse, actually with Ron, and there was that whole connection to the lighthouse in Fairyland. And he said to me at one point, because somebody asked him about whether you are inspired, like, is it like a work of art every time you paint? And he said no. He said, au contraire, you know. I don't think Jerry said au contraire, but he said, you know, it's a daily craft. He says, I get up every day and I do the strokes. I get up every day and I do the strokes. And then one of those days, there's a work of art. But he said that the craft itself is what makes him an artist, and the works of art are just like the sublime result of all that work. And I really got that because that's how I've always worked. Like I've always been really disciplined as a practicing singer, as a practicing musician. I always practiced. And I saw it as a daily craft, right? And out of those daily visits to the piano and to the, I still use a fountain pen. Like I work by hand. And I have a book and a pen, and I go at it. And so that's sort of my communion with the art. And the muse is not always there, but I remember Jerry, and I believe that it's in the practice and the discipline and the visiting it every day that I come up with my work, you know?
So is there a feeling or a mood you're trying to convey with your music?
Well, I think that it's really parallel to what I'm going through in my life. Like I guess I have recorded 5 albums, and I was on the 11/11 album as well, which is a 6th album. But each of the albums were parallel to the journey I was on at that point in my life. For example, when I lived in Quebec, when I went for 3 days and stayed 10 years, like I had no idea I was going to spend all this time in Quebec. But if I think back to my life, like when I was a young girl, I went to Expo, and I remember spending the summer in Montreal and hanging around with all these French people because my cousins lived on the French side of the South Shore. And I remember coming back to school and the teacher saying, "What did you do the summer?" And I said, "Well, I was in Montreal, and I'm going to learn how to speak French." And I'm going to, like, so I was convinced a long time ago that French was a big part of where I was going, but I didn't quite know how it was going to happen.
That's interesting, yeah. And one of those 5 albums is Chanson Hérissée.
Very beautifully said.
Fully French.
All French.
And
nominated for Francophone Album of the Year.
Magnificent album. I love that album.
Thank you, Karl.
And oh gosh, yeah. I mean, I can hear you sing now.
Well, that is a particularly beautiful production because it's Gilles Vigneault's producer and musical director for 17 years, and Gilles Vigneault's band.
Yeah.
So that was a bonus.
It is a wonderful album, and but the French language is so beautiful. Do you find it's a beautiful language to sing?
It's an exceptionally beautiful language to sing for 2 reasons. There's a lot of nasal sounds, and from the days of studying with my singing teacher, like it's really good to sing up into the nasal resonator, but not to sound nasal, but to sing in nasal resonators. And secondly, you can be more dramatic in another language. Like I can sing anything in French because it's not my language, so I don't know if you understand. It's almost like you're not as self-conscious in a way, even though you'd think you'd be more self-conscious singing in another language. But for me, it's the opposite. I've actually studied 5 languages. Languages are my total passion. I'm now singing in German, actually.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I got 4 songs in German.
Excellent.
I did a concert last year in Germany, and it was a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
It was a sold-out show, and
So what are some of the more memorable gigs you've done in your career?
well, I have to think.
Because you've done so many
So
in so many
many.
different places.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, Paris stands out.
yeah.
Paris was pretty exceptional. And I also played at the Place des Arts in Montreal. And that was but every time I set foot on the LSPU hall stage, it was fantastic. The hall is a beautiful place. Like, it has amazing energy, beautiful.
It's very intimate.
Very
as
intimate.
well, yeah.
And that's what I love, you know? Like, if you can get on a stage that feels, no matter if there's like 1,000 people or 3,000 people or 30, but you can create that connection with your audience, for me, that's everything with performing. I've now decided it's the most important thing, is the connection with the people. And I really feel it. And even a Holy Heart is a wonderful theater. It's bigger, but it has an intimate feel too, you know. And I played down I played in Indiana too, but more memorable even was I played down in Alabama at the Magnolia Springs, Alabama Jazz Festival. There was a man wandering down George Street the night I released my album These Days, down under the Majestic. There was a bar called Grafenberg's.
Okay,
And the windows were open that day, and he walked by and he came and he said, "Well, young lady, would you like to come to Alabama?" And I went, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I think you'd like our little Magnolia Springs Jazz Festival." And I said, "I'm there." And anyway, 5 years later, 5 whole years passed, he calls me up and says, "Hi, this is Ron McLean. Remember me from Alabama?" And I said, "Totally." So I ended up going there. That was 2008, and it was spectacular.
Mary, about 6 years ago, you revealed publicly that you had been diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis.
Yeah, downer.
So I wanted to talk to you about it because this is a lung condition, right? And for a singer, that must have been rather devastating to hear.
Yeah. It was very devastating because when I first was told, I actually didn't know what it was. I'd never heard of it. And I said to the doctor, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, we call it the miner's disease." And I said, "Well, you know, I gave up working in the mines 10 years ago, right?" I've never been in a mine. And then he said, "Well, you know, there's other ways that you can get it, like exposure to asbestos." We had coal growing up. We had a coal furnace, but none of my brothers or my mom ended up with it. There's also a connection to cigarette smoke. I did sing in bars 27 years before they put the no smoking ban. That's my probable, I'm thinking that it could have been there. But then they also have an idiopathic component to the explanations, which means they don't really know. So at one point I realized that it was better to just accept it than to try to figure out how I got it, because I had it. How do I go about it? So then that's when I asked him, "So what's the cure?" And he said, "Well, there is none." And I was like, "Oh, that's really, really unfortunate," because there is the potential of getting a lung transplant, but I would need a double lung transplant. And I also have an autoimmune factor in all of this that basically disqualifies me from being a candidate. So then I was pretty down about it because I didn't really know what I was going to do about it. So, and I never talked about this because I was really afraid to share it, mostly for my career. Mostly I was thinking, will people start to look at me and try to hear if there's something going on? Will it make any difference in my hiring? And so I mostly kept it secret for that. But then I remember meeting a friend of mine when I was out in Vancouver the last time I was there. She said, "Has it ever occurred to you that your people may want, your people, like your friends, and the people that like your music, that they may want to know this?" And I said, "Well, why would they want to know this?" Because they said, because they may want to help you, or also it may make them feel closer to you. And then I said, "You're totally right." In a way, I was hiding something really important from people, and I wanted to. I realized being afraid of it was actually harder than being brave enough to talk about it. So once I told people, then I was like, okay, that's gone now. It's out there. And I've actually sung more in the last few years. It took me a couple of years to get...
Well, the doctor told you not to give up singing. He said it was good.
He said it was not only good, he said, walking's good, swimming's great, and singing is sublime. Those were his words. He said, singing actually tricks your lungs into thinking they're performing better than they are. And I knew what he meant, you know, because when you're singing, you're using your total lung capacity, and you're really exercising the elasticity of the lungs and all the breathing work, and it is good. And so for the first year and a half, I didn't sing. I thought, okay, I'm going to put my things in order, as they say, put your affairs in order, whatever that means. And I was just going to do the things I thought I wanted to do if I had a short time to live. And then one day I woke up and I went, sure, that's not even me. This is not me. Like, I'm a total fighter. And my mom was a fighter. Like, we come from a family of scrappers, you know. And I just said, that's it. I'm going to go. I'm going to figure out what alternatives are out there. I found out some information about a couple of clinics in Germany. And through the help of a GoFundMe campaign, I was able to, thanks to all the people behind me, I was able to go over to Germany, and I took immunotherapy treatments for about 1.5 years. Then I went back to another clinic. I went again last year. It's an alternative that seems to be helping to slow down the process, because the prognosis is not great when you look on the internet, but I never look at the internet anymore, because I just believe as long as I keep healthy, as fit as I can, as long as I keep singing, because the singing is really not only the physical payoff, but it's so important for my heart and my soul. And so that's it. I just keep going. You know, maybe I'll be one of those, like those golf players that dropped dead on the golf course, but they died doing what they wanted to do. Who knows? But I try not to think too far into the prognosis and where I'm going with it, and I really live one day at a time.
Well, we hope that you continue singing for many, many years to come. Thank you very much for being on the program.
It's my honor and pleasure, and so great to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. And that's our program for today.
If you want convenience, Marie's Mini Mart is here for you. A one-stop shop for a variety of products, home-style breads, sandwiches, plus check out our freshly baked artisan breads and single-serve desserts exclusively at our in-store bakery on Frecker Drive. With 25 locations, wherever you go, there we are.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
I don't want this to be all there is. There's a whole wide world out there.
Make hats, Mitzi.
You're the strangest person I know.
I didn't want to come back. Now I don't want to leave.
Maleficent is a threat. It's all coming together. No more fairies.
Most people living with it don't even know they have it.